Well, welcome everybody to our, I guess we could call it in a way a kind of transnational, but in the sense of being actually just across the nation. I don't know if anybody is zooming in from the Philippines or somewhere else, but I'm very, very excited to introduce Rhacel Salazar Parrenas, and if I've said any of those things wrong, please correct me. Is our speaker today. She's the professor of sociology and gender studies at the University of Southern California. She does incredible and prolific work on labor, gender, international migration, human trafficking, families, economic sociology. She manages to combine most of those things in her research projects and publications. She's written a number of very major, important, and intriguing, I think, books on transnational migration and families, among others, Servants of Globalization, Migration and Domestic Work, Illicit Flirtations, Labor, Migration and Sex Trafficking in Tokyo, Children of Global Migration, Transnational Families Engendered Woes. She's very good at titles, and for her troubles, she has received just in 2019 the Jesse Bernard Award from the American Sociological Association, and that award it's a kind of career award in recognition of scholarly work that's enlarged the horizons of sociology, basically to encompass fully the role of women in society. Rhacel is also a PhD in ethnic studies from UC Berkeley, so she's one of our alums. And it's with great pleasure that I introduce her today. I'm very happy to meet you, Rhacel, and I'm looking forward to hearing your talk. Thank you so much for agreeing to speak over Zoom.
Yeah, so thank you for having me. So as people are trickling in, I'm seeing names of sociologists. So honestly, I started getting nervous because I wrote this not as a traditional sociology talk. So there's really no discussion of the methods. So if you want to ask me about the methods, you can ask me at the end. And also the literature review is really brief because I figured I wasn't really talking to other sociologists so much. So how I'm really situating this in sociology is not going to be as apparent in this talk. And it's really more of me trying to use this as an opportunity to share some ethnographic narratives from my work. So I want to start by thanking the Center for Southeast Asian Studies at Berkeley, the Associate Director, Sarah Maxim, and the Director, Nancy Peluso, for inviting me to share my work, my current work. So I really appreciated this invitation actually because it gave me that last drive to finish my last empirical chapter for this book that I'm trying to finish on migrant domestic workers in the United Arab Emirates. So I'm now gonna share my screen and just proceed with my talk here. And I am going to play from start. Okay. So the talk then that I'm going to give today, like I said, on the Philippine state's management of domestic worker migration, draws from this larger project on the constitution of migrant domestic workers as unfree laborers. So according to the International Labor Organization, there are, let me just look at the time here. There are an estimated 11.5 million migrant domestic workers across the world, and the largest constituency of them are actually Southeast Asians. And then approximately 27% of them are located in Arab states. And so then by Southeast Asian, we're talking about Filipinos and Indonesians, and Indonesians actually outnumber Filipinos. Estimates of Indonesians are about 2.1 million domestic workers globally, and there's about 1.5 million Filipinos. And so then across the globe, migrant domestic workers are actually legally constituted as unfree workers. And this is because their legal status is contingent on their sole and continuous live-in employment in one household. And so this is the case like across the globe in key migrant destinations, including Hong Kong, Malaysia, Singapore, Israel, England, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and the list just goes on and on. It's really just Italy where this is not legal. And more recently, Canada has changed its laws. And so this status of being unfree is particularly pronounced for migrant domestic workers in Singapore and Arab states. It's because in these destinations, domestic workers must secure the permission of their employer in order to change jobs or to quit their jobs. And this is even the case if they're physically abused by their employer. And so without question, the unfree status of domestic workers leaves them highly vulnerable to abuse because it places them in sort of this position, like it places them, it makes them subject to the arbitrary authority of their employers and basically leaves their employers and domestic workers in this relationship of asymmetric interdependence. So what I found in my study, however, is that this positionality does not lead to the universal abuse of domestic workers, which really contradicts works of other scholars. And from my interviews with 85 Filipino migrant domestic workers in the United Arab Emirates, and which are interviews that I collected not using convenience sample, let me just say that, I found that employers do not respond uniformly to their arbitrary authority over domestic workers, as some maximize it, others neutralize it, and others actually try to mitigate it. So in this talk, I wish to examine how the sending state of the Philippines manages the labor migration of domestic workers. More specifically, I wish to ask first, how does the sending state of the Philippines acknowledge and attend to the vulnerabilities confronted by migrant domestic workers? And second, how does it work towards the mitigation of these vulnerabilities? So to address this question, these questions, I'm going to first situate my discussion briefly in the literature, specifically just on what other people have said about the Philippines as a sending state. Then I'm going to explain how my argument diverges from the literature. Then third, I'm going to provide some context and give a brief overview of domestic worker migration from the Philippines. And then I will then turn to my findings and describe how the Philippine state works towards reducing the vulnerabilities of migrant domestic workers. So the Philippine state management of labor migration has been the focus of previous studies. Leading these discussions are the sociologists Robin Rodriguez and Ana Guevara. Rodriguez argues that we must consider the Philippines to be a quote unquote labor brokerage state that promotes the outmigration of workers at the expense of their protection. She likens migration to an export processing zone, one that, quote, mobilizes and exports a commodity, workers, that actually rivals other export commodities in terms of profitability, unquote. So in agreement, Ana Guevara argues that the state perceives migrant workers as exported commodities and maximizes their quote unquote export value by promoting their gendered racialization as superior workers. And of these two studies, it's Rodriguez that closely examines the sending state and its governance of migrant workers. And she's quite critical of the Philippines' protectionist policies. Bilateral agreements with receiving states are, for instance, dismissed as nothing but a means of facilitating low-wage labor, and pre-departure educational seminars are argued to be nothing but mechanisms of deflecting state responsibility. So in this talk, I wish to add nuance to our understanding of the relationship of migrant workers to the sending state. And as Nana Oishi and Maria Cecilia Wong have likewise argued, the Philippines is not one that just exports its workers. According to both Oishi and later on Wong, the state delimits the export of workers if it is at the cost of the gendered morals of the nation. These works tell us that the state does not just promote migration, but it also tries to protect migrant workers. Indeed, the Philippines maintains a robust protectionist immigration program, one that I argue, centers on the establishment of what I call aspirational labor standards, which it tries to put in place, enforce, by first legally instituting memoranda of understanding with receiving states, second, regulating the close management of outmigration by of domestic workers and other migrant workers through private recruitment agencies and government agencies. And finally, by actually attempting to uphold them, like uphold these standards through the direct negotiation of domestic workers in the workplace. So I refer to these standards of employment as aspirational. And so some of this is like the minimum wage of $400 is one, or like requiring that domestic workers have 8 continuous hours of rest per day. And so these like standards that the Philippines tries to enforce, I call it aspirational, or I call them aspirational because of the challenge of their enforcement, as neither receiving states nor employers are actually legally bound to recognize them. And so as a weak state, the Philippines thus faces the challenge of enforcing these standards. And so the challenge for the Philippines is this, like, how can it ensure that employers humanely manage their power over domestic workers? How does it ensure that employers neither maximize nor neutralize, but instead mitigate their power over domestic workers? How does it enforce the recognition of these aspirational labor standards? So in addition to imposing these country bans, like they'll ban the migration of domestic workers to certain countries, I found that the protectionist program of the Philippines relies a great deal on the direct negotiation of domestic workers with employers. And this strategy seems to be actually counterintuitive because it goes against like our common assumption of how the weak, quote unquote weak, are supposed to behave, because we assume, or we are told to assume, that they don't participate in direct negotiation. And so this is an argument long made by James Scott, who basically says like relatively powerless groups will engage in this more kind of covert forms of resistance because they have to, quote unquote, avoid any direct confrontation with authority. But the Philippines, as a weak state, depends on domestic workers who they educate of minimal labor standards prior to migration to be those that ensure that these standards are actually upheld in the workplace. And so how this occurs is the process that I wish to establish in this talk. So encouraging domestic workers to engage in direct negotiation as a strategy of ensuring that its recommended labor standards are upheld creates a paradox for the Philippine state. And so what I found is this, the Philippine state finds itself needing to simultaneously cultivate the consent and resistance of migrant domestic workers to the arbitrary authority of employers. To secure the demand for its migrant workers, the Philippines must abide by the laws of receiving states, including its Constitution of Domestic Workers as unfree persons, and their concomitant subjection to the arbitrary authority of employers. But then to justify its deployment of migrant workers to this highly vulnerable job, the Philippine state must establish minimum labor standards so as to ensure that employers do not abuse their arbitrary authority. And then to enforce them, they periodically turn to migration bans, but more frequently I found they depend on acts of claims making and direct negotiation by domestic workers. And so due to its reliance on domestic workers, the Philippines must promote an ethos of autonomy as it works to empower workers to directly question employers who abuse their authority. The autonomy of domestic workers is, however, constrained and better fits what my sister, also a professor, Juno Parrenas, describes as arrested autonomy, as the arbitrary authority of employers retards their empowerment and maintains the risks of their occupation. So domestic workers comprise of the largest group of migrant workers from the Philippines. The vast majority of these workers migrate to Arab states. While this is the case, this group of domestic workers are actually the least represented in the literature on migration. Yet it's a particular group of migrant workers who pursue domestic worker in Arab states, and that is basically rural poor women. And so as this figure illustrates, they, as indicated by, the 85 domestic workers I interviewed in the UAE, they tend to come from rural areas across the country. So this sort of really goes against the migration, like the dominant assertion in migration studies that they come from one area because of networks, and this is not what's happening here. And the vast majority actually originate from rural areas within provinces that have a human development index, which is, the composite based on life expectancy, education, and per capita income that are below the country average. So they come from places like Lanao, Maguindanao, Basilan, and Agusan del Norte. And they come from areas with quite stagnant economies that are without labor market wage opportunities. Wage labor market opportunities. And so as many do not have access to wage labor, it's highly unlikely they make, the recommended daily minimum wage of like $6 in the Philippines. Indeed, many say they migrate to survive. They migrate to feed their children, clothe them, and reduce child mortality. If not for migration, they would unlikely afford the cost of antibiotics and will consequently experience the death of a child, as had occurred for a handful of my interviewees. And so as one, I'll quote one interviewee, Mary Lou, I call her, and she's 45 years old, and she told me, quote, why she migrated, because it's very poor in the Philippines. Like my family is only farmer. I have 2 kids. I need to come here because I need to make money for my kids. We're only farmers planting rice, unquote. And so prior to migration, nearly all of my interviewees resided in a hut or a wooden house with a thatched roof, which are residences that are prone to ruin by natural disasters. Most did not have access to electricity or running water, and for their drinking water, they would usually get it from a well, or they would purchase it from a neighbor, which costs about like 8 US cents a gallon or 2 cents a liter. And those without electricity usually rely on a gas lamp, or they would like illegally get it from a neighbor, and that costs them about $2 US per month per item that they use for the, like for an electric fan to use it, it would cost them $2 US. They cannot afford the cost of installing their own electricity. Labor and materials will cost about $140 US. And so contrary to the longstanding assumption that migrants are not the poorest of the poor, Filipino migrant domestic workers in Arab state tend to be this population. And so there's about 10% of people in the Philippines, they say, that do not have access to electricity. And the people that I interviewed tend to be of that group. And so the level of this poverty is, of their poverty as members of the rural poor is even reflected in the government mandated pre-departure orientation seminar. As many have never ridden an airplane, domestic workers bound to an Arab state are given a lecture on travel logistics, informing them of what they should do upon arrival at the airport, telling them how to identify the appropriate counter where they can check in for their flight, explaining to them why they should not worry when their bags are taken from them to be placed in cargo, illustrating to them what's a boarding pass, and warning them to not take into their possession the blanket provided by the airline when they deboard the plane when they arrive at their country of destination. To further ward any temptation that they'll steal the blanket, participants are sometimes even told that the airline would be able to track them down for stealing the blanket by checking which seat is missing one after all the passengers have disembarked the aircraft. So in contrast, the government seminar for domestic workers bound to other countries, for example, Singapore, does not include instructions on how to board an airplane. So there's this hierarchy of destinations for domestic workers, as you can see here. The people who go to Arab states tend to be those with the least resources. And they also tend to be those that are ineligible to go to other places, because all other destinations require actually a minimum educational attainment, with everything above tier 4 requiring at least a high school degree. And so a lot of the people who end up in Arab states do not have that, and they usually just reach up to a sixth grade education, even if that. So let me now describe and analyze the actual state management of domestic worker migration. So since 1974, the Philippines has maintained this robust protectionist regime. much of which is controlled by the Department of Labor and Employment. And so there's basically two key administrations that control migration. One is POEA to the left here, and to the right is OA. POEA is the one that regulates the involvement of the private sector in migration. So recruitment agencies, they manage, they're the ones that try to look for labor market opportunities. And then third, they actually have the responsibility of, quote, ensuring that ensuring the, quote, rights to fair and equitable employment practices, unquote, of Filipino workers. And then OA, which is the other big organization and is responsible for, quote, protecting and promoting the welfare of migrant workers. And so central to the governance of migrant domestic workers is the enactment and enforcement of minimum labor standards, the bulk of which had been established under the 2006 Household Service Workers Policy Reform Package. So under this policy, basic labor standards for domestic workers were implemented, including the current minimum wage requirement of $400 a month, which is twice what it used to be, which was $200. And then the government sees to the enactment and enforcement of these minimum labor standards in three central ways. First is by regulating migration as foreign policy and treating it as foreign policy. Second is managing out migration. And third, by empowering migrant workers. And so due to time constraints, I'm unable to give you this comprehensive description of this protectionist regime. So streamlining my discussion, I'm gonna just talk briefly about the regulation of migration via foreign policies. And then second, I'm gonna skip the managing of out-migration and recruitment agencies, and I'm gonna really just focus on how they try to empower migrant domestic workers to advocate for their, for the recognition of these minimum labor standards at work. So briefly, in regards to the regulation of migration as foreign policy, the Philippine state, as established in the 2009 amended Migrant Workers Act, limits migration destinations to those, quote, where the rights of Filipino workers are protected, unquote. So these are destinations with adequate labor and social laws for the protection of migrant workers, signatories to multilateral conventions that are pertinent to migrant labor, and or have concluded a government-to-government agreement with the Philippine state on the rights of Filipino migrant workers. So protecting migrant worker rights through government-to-government agreements is a strategy that the Philippines has actually used since 1968, beginning with the United States. And so for the Philippine state, labor migration is a matter of foreign policy, and it accordingly relies on government-to-government agreements to extend protection to migrant workers. While Filipino migrant workers can be found in approximately 180 destinations, the Philippine state has concluded bilateral agreements with 22 countries, including Canada, Norway, Papua New Guinea, and Saudi Arabia. So you kind of get a sense of how diverse it is. The Philippine state pursues government-to-government agreements if prevailing labor standards in a country of destination does not meet its recommended standards of employment. And that would be like, for them, I think they care most about minimum wage, or if industry standards fail to adhere to labor recruitment policies of the country. And so one would be like, migrant workers are never supposed to pay for the cost of their labor migration. And so the state tries to make sure that, they don't pay. And so this would be the case, for instance, in countries such as, Singapore and Saudi Arabia, where, there's no minimum wage in those countries. And so for domestic workers, what are the aspirational labor standards? So it's minimum monthly wage of $400, 8 hours of continuous rest per day, right to 3 meals per day, decent accommodations, and more recently, the right to a day off, a rest day per week. And so notably excluded is like, they don't have the right to a cell phone, for example. So for domestic workers, the Philippine state initially enforces these recommended standards through the use of, what they call the standard employment contract. And this contract enumerates the Philippine state's minimum standard of employment for the country of destination. And so it just like sort of lays out like what the minimum labor standards should be for that job. And so it's when governments refuse to recognize the terms stipulated in the standard labor contract that the Philippine state will then resort to imposing a ban on the migration of their workers to that particular country. Or they'll pursue a government-to-government agreement. So they usually will end the ban once that government-to-government agreement has been established. So in the case of Arab states, the Philippines has concluded an agreement on domestic workers in Lebanon in 2012, Jordan also in 2012, Saudi Arabia in 2013, United Arab Emirates in 2017, and Kuwait in 2018. And so acknowledging the limits of merely relying on regulation towards the protection of migrant workers, employers do not necessarily agree to the terms of government-to-government agreements. And in the UAE, the domestic workers who I interviewed repeatedly complained about how their employers refuse to, for example, recognize the $400 minimum wage that they had signed to agree to in the standard labor contract. So how does the Philippines then address this challenge? I found that they actually turned to the education of migrant workers on their rights and responsibilities as quote unquote overseas Filipino workers. So as mentioned earlier, one of the two central offices of migrant governance is OWA, the Overseas Workers Welfare Administration. Its mission is to develop and implement welfare programs and services, including, quote, educating migrants on the realities of overseas work, unquote. So at the heart of the fulfillment of its goal is the pre-departure orientation seminar. And so this pre-departure orientation seminar was made compulsory for all migrant workers since 1983. It's a one-day country-specific seminar that covers all these topics. So in recognition, however, of the greater vulnerability of domestic workers as compared to other migrant workers, domestic workers were required to take these additional seminars, particularly one on stress management and language and culture training. And so because of this, so while PIDOS is usually like 2 hours for all other workers, it's a minimum of 1 day for domestic workers, that's Singapore, but it's usually longer than 1 day. So for all domestic workers going to Arab states, they have to take 3 days of this class. So for my research, I observed 80 hours of these classes. And so then on any given day, thousands of migrant domestic workers arrive at one of the Overseas Workers Welfare Administration buildings to complete this mandatory pre-departure orientation seminar. And one can catch a glimpse of them lingering and patiently waiting for the facilities to open to avoid traffic. Some leave as early as 3 a.m. and arrive at OWA at 5 a.m. and they wait for the doors to open at 8 a.m. The buildings where these seminars are held are not the most modern of structures, but instead they're old, they're dark, and they're damp. One visibly sees the lack of government resources in the absence of lights in some of the hallways, the broken elevators, which prospective migrants are actually not allowed to use. And then the lack of toilet paper in the restrooms and the absence of central air conditioning. Safety does not seem to be a concern while white plastic chairs fill almost every inch of classrooms, preventing doors from fully opening and not giving participants, almost all of whom are women, as you can see from these pictures, much room to move. A room with a maximum capacity of 60 people will usually have 100 attendees in it. And so participation in CPDEP ensures that domestic workers do not leave the Philippines with a blind eye to the vulnerabilities of their migration, which the state admits to them includes rape. While these vulnerabilities are already known to many prospective migrants due to their circulation in the media, some first learn of them in this seminar. This had been the case, for example, for Jonah, who migrated at the age of 23 years old. She recalls her surprise when first hearing of these various vulnerabilities, as she told me, quote, OWA reminds us that if you are experiencing bad conditions with your employers, you find a way to escape. When I attended training in the Philippines, I thought to myself, what is this? I have to escape, unquote. Likewise, 29-year-old Annalyn, who first migrated to the UAE 10 years prior when she was only 19 years old, which is illegal, only managed to board a plane because of her quote unquote pure courage. As she shared to me, just pure courage. I just kept praying. I just kept praying because I get to think of all these women raped, unquote. So someone like Annalyn was really actually frightened that she was going to get raped once she arrived in the UAE. So the question then is, how does the state use CPDEP to empower workers in the workplace? So at first, it works to strongly instill the identity of domestic workers as workers. In the seminars I attended for domestic workers bound to Arab state, the reminder that they're a worker was, kind of mentioned throughout the 3 days. And so I'll just give you one of the pep talks that I heard. So in one pep talk, the teacher was saying, quote, "You are not a helper, but a worker. Never say you are a domestic helper. Always say you are a household service worker or domestic worker. You are a professional. You are an ambassador of the Philippines," unquote. And so to further enforce their identity as a worker, they're also kind of told that they're like superior to their counterparts from Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, India, Indonesia. And so they get quizzes, as you see from these blue books. And so then after one quiz, it was a quiz on like how to greet your employer in Arabic. And they did poorly. The teacher got so mad at them, and he was like, started reprimanding them and saying, this is not how you're supposed to perform. You're supposed to perform better. You guys are like, the highest paid domestic workers in the world, and you are not performing to the standard of being the highest paid group. So that was kind of interesting. So besides sort of instilling this identity of being like a worker, a second thing that's done in CPDEP is they try to fortify the identity of domestic workers as a migrant worker with rights by actually outlining the minimum labor standards that they have to expect in their workplace. So in these seminars, they're told, like I said, the $400 a month, the right to a day off, free clothing and toiletries if they're going to Arab states, the 8 hours of rest per day, decent accommodations, employers are supposed to pay for their plane tickets. And so the instructors basically enumerate what's listed in the standard labor contract. And so by instilling this collective identity of domestic workers as workers, CPDEP is trying to counter the lack of labor standards that they are likely going to confront in their country of destination. And so then a third thing that is done in CPDEP is they're also kind of told that they have to be like a good worker. They're being prepared to be a good worker. So what is a good worker? A good worker is someone who is basically subservient to their employer. And so then also, in addition to that, they're basically told of the limited rights that they have as domestic workers. So while they're told they're like these aspirational labor standards, they're also told that they actually have very minimal rights in the country of destination. So one thing they learn is that they do not have the right to a cellular phone, that their employers can actually legally confiscate the phone when they first arrive in the country of destination. They actually might not have access to the internet. They might not be able to communicate with their family. And so they're actually warned about that. And so in CPDEP, the domestic workers are told to accept their subordination, which is captured, in the following narratives shared by different instructors. So I'm going to give you more quotes, more crazy quotes. And so here they're told, "You are a Filipino worker. You are the one who will adjust to the employer. You cannot change them. You need to get along, especially with your madam. If they say hurry up, don't freak out." And then in another case, they're told, "If you are a cell phone, you're an open line. Everything depends on your employer. Your work, your rest, they are awake at 2 a.m. You can ask for permission to sleep and they'll say no. You can't tell your madam, it's 10 p.m., go to sleep now." And then they all laughed in the room. "You have no freedom. If you have no day off, you will look out the window and wave at people. Homesickness is often caused by isolation." So in CPDEP, domestic workers are taught to defer to this, absolute power of their employers. CPDEP relays the message that it is acceptable for employers to control their most minute actions and behaviors, including when they should be awake and asleep, and when they should have a day off. And to be reprimanded is also taught to be part of the job, as reflected in these quote unquote widely used phrases that they're taught in their Arabic language training. So while taught to be subservient, domestic work, and so to be subservient means to be a good worker, right? So domestic workers are also encouraged to ensure the enforcement of the minimum labor standards of their employment. So in other words, the Philippine state walks this tightrope of simultaneously promoting consent to the authority of employers and resistance against sort of the abuse of this authority. And so cultivating consent, it prepares migrant workers to meet the labor expectation of employers, including, being subordinate and subservient. But cultivating resistance, it simultaneously trains them to question the abuse of this authority, but to a limited extent, so as not to question the former and put at risk the continuous outflow of workers from the country. So how states walk the tightrope of cultivating subservience and resistance, promote the collective identity of workers, maintain a smooth flow of migration, and at the same time, limit the extent of workplace empowerment is captured in this animated discussion of food raised by an instructor during, the module on employment contract. So to instill the point that domestic workers have the right not only to free food, but to also 3 meals per day. Teachers often discuss types of food one can expect to eat, as well as the typical sizes of their meals. In one seminar, the teacher asked a room full of around 80 hopeful migrants, who here likes to eat chicken? Raise your hand if you like to eat chicken. Then on cue, all of the participants raised their hand, inviting the teacher to continue to make his point about the appropriate food consumption of domestic workers. So then he proceeds to tell them, quote, in Saudi Arabia, there are a lot of chickens, big chickens, fat chickens. Who here likes to eat every part of the chicken? Raise your hand. Great that you like to eat every part of the chicken. Because in Saudi Arabia, you will get to eat the head, the neck, the wings, and the butt of the chicken. Now repeat after me. Which parts of the chicken will you eat? Unquote. And then almost predictably, each and every participant then responded and screamed in unison, the head, the neck, the butt, and the wings. So they shared this response in a matter of fact tone and without humor. The teacher then ended the discussion by punctuating his point and saying, remember that you will not eat the breasts and thighs. Those are for your employers. So I use this narrative as an example because it captures the Philippine state perception of domestic workers as subordinate, albeit with basic rights, including their entitlement to free food from employers. So how then does the Philippine state ensure that the basic rights of domestic workers are met? Reflecting its status as a weak state, it must rely a great deal on the efforts of domestic workers. And so this leads to my fourth and final point about CPDEP. So in this seminar, prospective migrants are explicitly and repeatedly told to quote unquote, talk to your employer if problems arise in the workplace and if employers are not abiding by the basic labor standards in that standard employment contract. And so every teacher I observed, for instance, repeatedly reminded students of the minimum monthly salary stipulated in their contract of $400 US. And so they would ask them, how much are you supposed to pay? $400. I mean, it was kind of, almost comedic, and it was just drilling it in their head that they had to get that money and that it was unacceptable if they got less. So then it raises the question, well, what if employers are not paying them what they're supposed to be paid, right? And so as a solution, instructors universally would tell domestic workers to quote unquote, talk to your employer, which indicates that the state relies on the individual solution of migrant workers for the enforcement of its policies. For example, one instructor advised seminar participants to pray they're assigned a good employer, after which they raised the question of what they should do if with the misfortune of not having one. He then told the participants that they should quote unquote talk to their employer, and if in Saudi Arabia, to go to the Ministry of Justice. He additionally shared other options, including reaching out to their local recruitment agency. A staff there could negotiate with employers on their behalf, calling family and have them inform the recruitment agency in the Philippines of their problem. And as a last resort, turn to the Philippine consulate or embassy. Notably, those likely to turn to Philippine authorities are those confronting the direst of situations. And so in another class, another teacher said, quote, talk to your employer or write them, do not fight, keep a copy of the letter. If not resolved, then go to the Philippine consulate or embassy, unquote. So let me now conclude. So the Philippine state faces the conundrum of knowingly deploying poor rural women to the highly vulnerable occupation of domestic work. Banning their labor migration, as recently imposed by Indonesia, is considered not an option because it supposedly disagrees with the liberal principle of freedom of movement. As officials repeatedly mentioned in interviews, the government cannot constrain the rights of citizens to choose migration. So how then does it mitigate the vulnerabilities engendered by the migrant regime of receiving states? So what's important to point out is that the Philippine state does not ignore these vulnerabilities, but instead has put them front and center of its protectionist regime, which is directed towards the implementation of labor standards to counter these vulnerabilities. Reflecting its status as a weak state, it, however, faces the challenge of enforcement. It finds itself relying a great deal then on migrant domestic workers to enforce these minimum labor standards. So this last point raises the question of whether or not Filipino migrant domestic workers attempt to enforce their rights. And maybe surprisingly, I found that they do, as reflected in these words from Alma. And so she shares, so I have this extensive quote by one of my interviewees that I will read. So she told me, and so this is not actually unusual, like it was very common for people I interviewed to talk to me about how they engaged in direct negotiation. And so as Alma shared with me, my sponsor told me I am not allowed to speak to other Filipinos. I asked her why. I told her that when she sees an Arab, she greets them and told her that we are like that as well. I am hard-headed. I fight back. Do you know my 2 years with them? One day did not go by that we did not fight. One time we were fighting. My job there was to take care of the child. She has a niece who was a liar. When she got home, I was surprised that she started just screaming at me. I could not accept someone screaming at me. I told her, I did not come here to be treated like this. If you want my service, use it. If you're not content with my service, send me back to the Philippines. I will go back anytime. What I learned is you have to talk back when you know you have to, because if you do not, they will abuse you. You have to show that you know how to fight back so they get scared too. They will eventually change their behavior. So, I mean, I want to say, though, that people are like, well, you met people on the street. And so these are the people who are not isolated. These are the people who are not abused. These are the people who, you know, have good relations with their employers. So I do want to say something about my interviews right now. And so the interviews that I collected with migrant domestic workers in the United Arab Emirates actually includes interviews with domestic workers with and without a day off. And that I made sure to diversify my sample by talking to domestic workers, you know, that represent a variety of experiences, and I ensured that variety of experiences by diversifying their employers. So I made sure that I interviewed domestic workers of in Arab families, in Emirati families, in Indian households, in European households, in American households, and in not so much Filipino households. It sort of just represented the bulk of the kinds of employers that you have there. So we should note, so I'm actually not done here, that it's not only the Philippine state, let me just stop this screen share. It's not only the Philippine state that validates claims-making acts, such as the one that I shared by Alma. There are various, you know, what you call rule makers, including intergovernmental organizations such as the ILO and rights organizations such as Human Rights Watch that advance these sort of moral claims about what should be like fair treatment of domestic workers. And so the circulation of such moral claims or moral standards are those that validate, you know, acts of claims making that domestic workers are being encouraged to do by the Philippine state, and in order to create labor standards in its absence. But the efforts of the Philippine state to encourage acts of claims making among domestic workers are, however, something we shouldn't really celebrate, because what the Philippines fails to do and perhaps cannot do is eliminate the risks that these domestic workers are facing when they migrate to these destinations. After all, employers need not recognize these acts of claims making. They can reject them. And those who are the most abused in their household are the ones who are likely going to have employers that will reject any act of claims making that they do. And so it's perhaps for this reason that every single pre-departure orientation that I attended in the Philippines repeatedly warned domestic workers that they will likely get raped in the country of destination. And so overall, the protectionist immigration program of the Philippines shifts the moral responsibility for the harms that cause and are caused in migration from the state to individual migrant domestic workers. And these include the poverty that encourages their migration, as well as the perils that they're likely to face upon migration. So let me end there. So thank you.
Okay, so Michelle Phillips asked where the 2.1 million Indonesians versus 1.5 million Filipinos estimates come from. That's the first question. The second question is from Mohammed Sarkar, who says he is from the UK, but he is also, he's a PhD student in York University in Toronto. And he's, I think, he says University of York. Okay, so I usually think of it as York University. I'm not sure of the answer to that question. So he is either a student in the UK or he is a student in Toronto. And his point is that given that somewhat of the success in some countries like the US, Lebanon, Israel, and the UK in attaining citizenship rights, industrial citizenship, I guess he calls it, through social activism. Do you see any hope to earn rights of migrant domestic workers in the GCC states through NGO activism or NGO-led activism by the workers? Okay, so that's the second question. And actually, before getting to another question, I just wanted to share Lisandro Claudio shared with us that he actually, before he came here to do his job, he had to go through one of these trainings as well and was subjected to all of the same kinds of requirements and extortions apparently that that are in play in general for the migrant workers. So it's a shame that we can't unmute you and have you talk about this yourself, Claudio, but anyway, thank you for sharing that. And then finally, for now, and we'll come back, there's a question from Andy Chang. And he has lots of questions. I'm just going to ask the first two, and then maybe I'll come back to the others. I hope that's okay, Andy. As the Philippine model of migration statecraft has circulated across the global south, what do you view as unique institutional features that render the Philippine state more capable of negotiating aspirational labor standards in comparison with other sending states? And how does the success of the Philippines' protectionist program hinge on the reputation of its migrant labor and the actions of other nations with which the Philippines competes? And I think I should reveal that Andy is also doing research on migration of Indonesians to, I think it's only Indonesians, but he's doing migration work in Southeast Asia as well. So why don't we start with that? That would be great.
Okay, yeah, thank you for these questions. And so just in terms of the sources, so it's in like, we actually, Rhacel Sylvie, who I've been writing with when we're doing these comparative works, and when we're doing comparative Filipino and Indonesian, we found this one article. So it's actually in one of our publications. I don't know the actual citation, but there was this one study that they gave this estimate of 2.1. If you email me, I'm sure I can find it. And then the 1.5 actually was when I had to actually, because the Philippine state doesn't say how many there are. So I actually had to look, I had to come up with this estimate myself by mining through the numbers that POEA released. And then in my book, Servants of Globalization, the second edition, in one of the footnotes, I explain specifically how I came up with 1.5 million as an estimate. So, but you can email me for the source for the 2.1 million for Indonesians. And so then Mohammed Sarkar's question about, I'm actually not familiar with industrial citizenship, but if you're talking about sort of rights that they can get through their workplace, you know, like through corporations, et cetera. I have a student, Minu Jung, writing about that as well in Singapore. So it's very different for domestic workers just because the workplace is, you know, in the private household. And so there's no like, rights that could extend to them really, unless employers choose to do it. So I have interviews with domestic workers, for example, whose employers always give them a perfect ratio bonus. So for Christmas, so if their company gave them a 2-month bonus, they would give their domestic worker a 2-month bonus, so you had some kind employers like that. And so that's informal. But in terms of the work that NGOs are doing, and so as we know from the work of people like Pardis Madavi, NGOs cannot exist in countries like the United Arab Emirates. And so the organizer of MigrantRights.org, for example, was even like banished from Qatar, which is where he grew up. And so that's like that stealth online website that tries to release data on the rights of migrant workers in that region. And so then, but I do think that the presence, particularly of not Amnesty International, of Human Rights Watch, and the studies that they release, even though those studies have questionable methods, those studies exaggerate the problem. Those studies actually do create they get covered in the media also. It creates this moral discourse about what is the right way to treat your domestic workers. And so the circulation of that information, I believe, does help towards creating standards of employment. So I hope that answers your question. And then Andy Chang, whose work I'm very familiar with, he has this award-winning article that looks at recruitment agencies in Indonesia. And so and so is there anything kind of unique about the Philippines, And so, as everyone says, as the World Bank says, the Philippines and its immigration regime is a model nation that other countries should follow. And indeed, other countries like Indonesia, Ethiopia, Sri Lanka have sent delegates to the Philippines and to observe, what they're doing, right? And so I think with the Philippines, what is different that they're doing, I found was that the state protectionist efforts, I think, are more, they're kind of just much more active about it. So for example, like in terms of, they demand higher standards, particularly for the wages of their domestic workers. So in the UAE, for example, it's like $400 that they demand. In contrast, Indonesians supposedly make only like $350. That's not the worst. The worst is actually Bangladesh. They only require $125 monthly minimum wage for their domestic workers. And so then to just systematically answer your question, so one difference I find with the Philippines and like other countries was the fronts, like the kind of the government bureaucrats that end up doing the advocacy work for Filipinos, I found have really this nationalist allegiance with the domestic workers that they're protecting. In contrast, I found in my interviews with Indonesian, Bangladeshi, kind of the diplomats that are there, the government bureaucrats, they really had this sort of distancing perception of them. Like, we're middle class. We are not like these working class people. We are like not like these Bangladeshi. So Rhacel, Sylvie, and I really recognize that too. It's like in our interviews with Filipino bureaucrats, they would be crying just because, to be a bureaucrat in these destinations are the worst, because you never hear of positive stories of domestic workers, because the only domestic workers you meet are those that run to the embassy and are abused, right? And so then it's just like one horror story after another. And so then when we interviewed the Filipino government officials, they would be crying, like literally crying. And then it's funny, you go to the Bangladesh consulate, embassy, and they're just like so like removed from these people's experiences. And so you really see the sort of different class, this sort of more stark like class barrier between the groups. And so we thought that was really interesting. So another thing that we found was that we found in these orientation seminars. So Rhacel Silly has looked at Indonesian orientation seminars. We haven't really written a comparative piece on this yet. We might not. And so I know you've written about that. But one thing that was really starkly different about the Philippines one was that teaching them of their rights, teaching them that they need to talk to their employers, telling them that they should advocate for themselves was not something that Rhacel saw among domestic workers in Indonesia. So in contrast, sort of this strategy of pushing domestic workers to fight for their rights was really uniquely Filipino, is what we recognized. But I don't know if you found something similar in the case of Indonesia.
Okay. So there's a lot of questions. I think what I'm going to do is prioritize questions from people that haven't had their questions articulated yet. So the next one is from Christian Guerrero, and later, if there's time, I'll go back to the other questions. Have you been able to do research interviews with domestic workers within the Philippines? And the reference is from rural provinces working as live-in, household help, or home workers in the metropolitan cities such as Manila. But I'm going to give you two more, okay? So, yeah. Then from Eileen Sana, thanks, Rhacel, for sharing your findings of your research. May I ask, in regards to UAE as a destination, how do you think the tadbir system can help improve the situation of migrant domestic workers? I don't know what that is, but anyway, that's the second question. And then from Crisanta de Guzman, have the Philippine government's policies towards migrant workers changed during the Duterte administration?
Okay.
Let's go with those.
So, okay, thank you for those questions. So it'll be quick. With domestic workers in the Philippines, I have not interviewed them. So I really just look at international labor migration. So I haven't looked at domestic workers in the Philippines. I do know that some of my informants in the United Arab Emirates had been domestic workers in the Philippines. And interestingly enough, some of them made us much money because they worked for foreign employers in Metro Manila. And so then that's why they were regretting going to the UAE, because they thought they would make $400, but they didn't. They were just making $200 a month. In terms of how the tadbir system, so the tadbir system is basically the efforts in the United Arab Emirates of the government to centralize the recruitment of domestic workers. So in the UAE before, there were these private recruitment agencies that partnered with recruitment agencies in the country of origin, and through job orders, then they would partner, and then they would place domestic workers from the country of origin to private households in the country of destination. And so the UAE is trying to dismantle this decentralized system and just have the country then be sort of the government control that inflow of migrant domestic workers. And then they also said that they're trying to create variety, like question the kafala system, that sponsorship system, a bit by giving domestic workers various options. So you could like work for multiple families, and your sponsor would be the beer center, so then it also gives employers who maybe don't want a live-in domestic worker the option to have like a house cleaner. Mm-hmm. And so also it gives you a little bit more time for like checking each other out and not being stuck with each other. And so, but if you look closely, so this is actually on the chapter I wrote about employers. So, but if you look closely at tadbir centers, the principles that made domestic workers vulnerable still was kind of there, because then, so employers basically still have more control over the situation than domestic workers. So you can email me, we can have a bigger discussion about this, about the specifics of the tadbir and what doesn't work. But we can't really tell yet because it's such a new system that was just implemented like a year ago.
Mm.
And so then we don't really know, like, kind of, the effects of that to, like, if the experiences of domestic workers who went through the Tadbir are different than those who went through a traditional recruitment agency. And so then with the Duterte question, and so like before Duterte, Aquino was president. Aquino actually, instituted a lot more protectionist programs for domestic workers. Particularly, he was really keen on making sure that workers don't pay for that agency fee. Of course, it still happens, but he was like pretty, really trying to implement that and trying to close agencies down that didn't adhere to this. With Duterte, he said he was going to do kind of like what Haiti does, which is like have an office for migrant work, like a government branch for migrant workers, but that hasn't really happened. Duterte has, threatened bans, and when he's imposed bans, such as like he did with Kuwait, those were short-lived. Mm. And so government to government agreements occurred almost as quickly as the ban was imposed. Mm. So he hasn't really done anything different, except probably the most drastic thing he did was he imposed a few-month ban on the migration, not just of domestic workers, but all migrants to Kuwait.
Okay. So a question from Andrew Johnson. Listening to the discourse of migrant labor among labor recruiters in Singapore, race or nationality is always part of the discourse. For example, Burmese workers are like X, Indonesian workers are like Y. And this seems to rely upon particular kinds of Orientalism, both coming from potential employers as well as agencies. So his question is, how are kinds of fantasies and fears surrounding race, nation, religion created, discussed, challenged, etc., within migrant worker communities? In other words, what kinds of national or racial imaginaries do states, workers, and employers deal with, produce, or reproduce? Maybe you can write your next book on that.
Thank you for your question, Andrew. And so then, so just if we just look at the pre-departure orientation seminar, there's really no mention of other groups so much, except that one point when they were reprimanded. Like they were reprimanded because they like all failed their quiz on how to greet someone in Arabic. And they're like, then they were asking, do you know where other domestic workers are from? And so they didn't know. And then the teacher said, they're from here. Do you know you make more money than them? No, we didn't know. Well, you do because you're the best workers. And that was really the only time that it was ever discussed. And so they're not, so I think the Philippines, just because they're the model nation, are kind of in the center and they're not in the margins. And I'm sure if you're training other people in the margins, the people in the center are probably always the ones they're talking about. So, but the Philippines, they're just like focused on the Filipino domestic workers. But in terms of, employer preferences, so, we interviewed recruitment agencies in the United Arab Emirates, and the employers didn't say this, but one recruitment agency was like, he had a sort of a ethnic type for domestic workers, like Kenyans are great for elderly care. Indonesians are the best cooks, so there's just this list, and Filipinos, I think they're just kind of, because they speak English, etc., they're like the most educated.
Yeah.
And so then, but what's interesting, however, is that, when you actually interview employers about what their preference is, some will, of course, they prefer their co-ethnics. And so the Indians would like to hire Indians, right? A lot of employers were very keen on not hiring workers of the same nationality because they don't want the domestic workers to kind of have a revolution, and so then they have an Ethiopian and they have a Filipino, they have an Indonesian, right? And employers also, when you ask them what their preference is, more than one mentioned that they're more comfortable hiring Filipinos because the terms of employment are very clear. The embassy lists how these workers should be treated, and then they compared it to other countries. They said it's like scary to hire an Ethiopian because the government doesn't really care how you treat them. And that's what the employers said. And so then what's very interesting then is the advocacy work of sending states actually seem to make a difference in creating standards of employment in domestic work, which is something that other scholars have not really recognized. And so, you know, a lot of scholars just tend to kind of just dismiss receiving states as these, you know, as just wanting to, like, you know, a source of foreign currency. But I think, you know, the narrative is a little bit more complicated than that, you know, and that's what I'm finding in this work.
Okay. Next question is from Pei Palmgren. And then I'm gonna give you a question also from Peter Zinnemann after that. So from Pei, it's can you circle back to Rodriguez and Guevara as to how the sending state manages the tension between protection and promotion amidst mass labor deployment? Are these protections new interventions? Is there a shift in the state's stance or framework since they published a decade ago? And from Peter, basically, is noting the difference in attitude between empathetic Filipino officials and less empathetic other officials is interesting. Do you have any speculation about why this is the case?
Could you repeat that question, that last
Sure.
one?
Peter's wondering if there's any speculation about why you've observed such a difference in attitude between Filipino officials who seem empathetic, and I'm guessing that this means something about kind of teaching people their rights, et cetera, and other officials seem to be less empathetic towards migrants. And he's wondering if maybe it has something to do with well, maybe not class dynamics, because he thinks that the class dynamics might be similar in both cases. So if you can comment on those two. Well, there's one more of someone who hasn't actually spoken yet. So let me give you that too, if you don't mind. This is from Bubbles Beverly Asor. And she is with the Department of Sociology at the University of the Philippines in Diliman. And she says, thank you for this great presentation. This is a very international attendance here. It's very exciting. My question is related to the aspiring migrants who attended the PDOS, whatever that is. I think is that the training?
Yes.
Okay. In your conversations with potential migrants or those about to leave for Gulf countries, how do the depictions and portrayal of the migrant realities in the Gulf countries reshape migrants' decisions and aspirations to work in those migrant destinations?
Okay.
To what extent do they negotiate, reconcile, discontinue, or perhaps delay their aspirations and expectations to work in those countries because of this migrant imaginary that's presented in the training by NGOs or by popular and public discourses? Okay, good questions.
Okay, so thank you for those questions. Starting, I didn't catch the name, Kate, about the differentiation between myself and earlier works on the Philippine state. I think as a sociologist, I'm just supposed to like critique the Philippine state, you know, because that's like, I remember I was writing this book. I was in a fellowship as I was working on this, and I was trying to defend the Philippine state, and my whole cohort was like attacking me, saying I'm just supposed to critique them. This was at the Institute for Advanced Study, and I was like, oh. But I was saying, no, it's more complicated than that. They're like, it's bad that you're being an apologist for the Philippine state, is what they told me. And so then the Philippine, I mean, but you know, I just feel like I don't really want to make it like a political agenda out of the study, you know, and I'm just relaying what I really saw. And
Exactly.
And so in 1996, the Migrant Workers Act was implemented. And in the Migrant Workers Act, and so this predated the 2010 books of Rodriguez and Guevara, the Philippines stated that they will no longer promote migration, but that their, duty as a nation is just to protect migrant workers, and that they will make sure then, because these people want to go there anyway, so that it's their duty as a state to protect them. So this, obviously is like a false assertion, because they promote them. Like as Robin Rodriguez said, they have marketing missions, they have these goals, the 2005, I think 2005 medium-term goal or something. I think that's what it's called. It's like, we're gonna have X number of migrants abroad by this year, So of course they promote migration. And so then, Rodriguez basically says that they don't protect them, they just promote them. And but then what I'm saying is, though, actually there is this very robust protectionist regime, and this protectionist regime actually really shapes their experiences. But this protectionist regime is really actually also important for us to examine, because it really gives us a window to the status of the Philippines as a weak state. And so I think, in the previous discussions of, the Philippines as a sending nation, it's, unfortunately really just analyzed in a vacuum. But we really have to look at what to which the Philippines is responding to when they create these programs. And that's why I was very keen on foregrounding this system as, a form of foreign policy, right? Because it is in relation to all these other countries. So then if you put it in that framework, then you can really see like how, there is protectionism going on here, but in the context of a country that's really weak. But then you have to really commend them that, as Andy Chang was saying, it seems like their workers are treated better, because then in the context that they're really weak, they seem to be getting something out of it, right? Even though minimal. So then the question about the empathy of Filipinos, right? And so I think what's really different about the Filipinos that migrate is the fact that they represent such a diverse group of migrants. In contrast, most other migrant origin countries are like just sending out working class, low-wage migrant workers. So in contrast, what you have then is like a lot of like middle class migrating with working class. So migration becomes something of kind of a national identity that many feel they're connected, and they are connected to. They have relatives who are abroad. In contrast, it's like a particular group of people who are migrating from Indonesia, from Vietnam, and that I think that's why you have the sort of the middle class not be so kind of feeling kind of attached to them, and the same way I feel that non-low-wage workers have a sense of attachment to migrant workers. A sense of kind of empathy develops from like the extreme vulnerabilities that migrant workers face. So, if you talk to Filipino domestic workers, there's a lot of barriers. They feel a lot of classism from middle class Filipinos. But then you also have to recognize that Filipinos have more resources if they are extremely abused than their counterparts from Bangladesh or Indonesia. And it's because of the robust middle class community. So if someone runs away because they're being abused, they're so, the ones that I interviewed, they talk about how all these middle class Filipinos were on the streets helping them, but it's actually illegal for someone to help someone who's running away. And so the fact that they risk their status, their legal status, by helping someone run away says something about kind of the affinity that they have. And so then the question about, how Filipino domestic workers, they suddenly hear these horror stories, right? Like, how do they respond? And that was that question, from the professor at UP, Dilaman, is actually something that like also gripped me when I was in these pre-departure orientation seminars. So, you know, in these seminars, they're told like, you're going to be raped, you're going to be raped, you're going to be raped. And so you're just sitting there and you're looking around, you're like, how are these people still going to go there, you know, after they're being told this, right? And then, but in one of these classes, there was a woman who happened to be sitting next to me. She suddenly raises her hand, and then she starts sharing the story. She's like, I just came back from Lebanon. I was raped. This is what happened to me. This was just 3 months ago. And then she's like sitting there, you're like, oh my gosh, she just came back from Lebanon. Yes, she's here. She's sitting next to me. That means she's about to go away again, right? And then she was going to, I believe she was going to Kuwait now, or Saudi Arabia, one of these two destinations. And for me, it was just this jaw-dropping moment staring at her like, how can you be leaving the country, right? Like after this just happened to you. And it was the teacher then asked the class, so we hear from her, anyone here change their mind then? Anyone here like, not want to go? And it was like silent. And then someone then said, do you still want to go? Yes, they still want to go. And then someone, I remember, said, each one of us has our own destiny. That's why we have to pray that she said, like, we know that not all of us in this room will get raped. Each one of us has our own destiny. That's why it's really important we pray to God that we have a good destiny. And that's what this, and so I think that just tells you sort of the mentality of the people in the room. And so this says a lot about who they are, right? And so then you have to basically look at them as a group of workers who are basically facing what you could call the unfreedom of poverty. And they basically have two horrible choices in life, which is the unfreedom of poverty in the Philippines or the unfreedom of servitude in the United Arab Emirates or another Arab country. And for them, the unfreedom and all the risks that go with servitude gives them much more promise for mobility than the unfreedom of poverty that they are facing in the Philippines, right? And the woman next to me, of course, during the break, I had to talk to her because I was just in this state of shock over her, situation. And then she tells me, oh, I still have a college student to support. I mean, I was just really blown away, right? And she's like, in her head, this is not going to happen to me again. And she just told me actually literally when she landed from the airplane from Lebanon, she didn't go home to her village. She went straight to a recruitment agency in Manila, signed up, and so she had been back in the Philippines for a month and she's about to leave again. And she was processing her out migration. And she was telling me how, she had the option of reporting this to the police when this happened, but she opted not to. It wasn't her employer who did it. It was someone else. But her employers wanted to rehire her. She didn't want to get rehired by them. So she was going back to the Philippines to go to another country. So she said if she had reported it to the police, she would be forced to stay in Lebanon to go into court against the guy. And then she'd have to work for her employer for another 2 years, which she really didn't want to do. So she opted to go back to the Philippines. And so she kind of didn't really think anything was going to come out of going to court in Lebanon. She's like, it happened, what else can I do? It happened.
Yeah. Wow. Okay, I am going to take the chair's prerogative in the last 5 minutes and ask you a question. We have to stop at 5:30, but my question is just, I'm just wondering in this context, what does calling the Philippine state a weak state do for your analysis? And I'm wondering if not only in terms of state theory or something like that, but what does this mean to the workers themselves? Is there some way that translates into either their experience or their means of articulating what their experiences are?
Okay, so thank you for that question about calling the Philippines a weak state. So, okay, I'm not like a political scientist. I don't like analyze nations. And when I was writing this chapter, which I really finished for this talk, I was like, do I call them a weak state? I felt afraid of using that term because I think it's like a loaded term. It means a lot of things probably in political science. But for me, what I was really just focusing on was, how we know in migration studies that you know, if we look at the relation, it's really just looking at the relationship of receiving and sending states, where receiving states are the most, you know, are the ones with like a greater power to determine like labor conditions, you know, when they're negotiating with the sending state, and that receiving states can use sending states to compete with one another to lower the wages of domestic workers. So if domestic workers are becoming unruly, or, you know, they do this a lot with construction workers, like this group of construction workers gets unruly, so then they'll ban them. So like in the United Arab Emirates, in Qatar, they, for example, have like banned, you know, Bangladeshi construction workers because they were unruly, and they go with another group. So when I'm really just talking about weak states and you know, it's really in relation to their lesser power than receiving nations that have like a wider net to, you know, solicit, to recruit migrant workers from.
Okay, thanks. Okay, well, we still had a bunch of burning questions, but I encourage you to email Rhacel. It really generated a great deal of discussion, Rhacel. It was a very, very provocative and interesting talk. Thank you so much for doing this. I wish we could go off and have dinner and a glass of wine and talk some more, but tragically, we might have to wait a couple of years for that. So on behalf of the Center for Southeast Asian Studies and UC Berkeley, I want to thank the Parrenas family for lending us yet another one of your brilliant daughters to speak to our faculty and student and postdoctoral community. And also for all of you from all over the world who came to hear this talk. So
thank you very much.
much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much.
Okay.